Hello mate, welcome back to the channel. We are here straight off the back of Preach's interview with Jonathan Rogers, the game director of PoE 2, and it was full of juicy information. They covered all of the new player testing that they've been doing. They had some campaign comments, some comments about mechanics, skills and combat, and some spicy takes from the man himself. I will link up the full hour-and-a-half VOD from Preach's stream, and this video is going to be a TLDR of all the highlights, so buckle up, let's get into it. Alright, the first section we're going to be talking about is content, and they've said they want to get as much content into the beta and into the game as possible, and the whole studio have been crunching ahead of the Creator Weekend showcase happening in LA, tying up loose ends and getting all of the finished stuff actually finished.
Like everyone suddenly realizes all the stuff they said was finished is actually not. After all, when you actually tell them people are going to see it.
Jonathan went on to say that like PoE 1, the intention is to have tons and tons of different things to do within the game at endgame specifically.
I'm definitely a fan of people having all sorts of different types of different endgames to play.
The way that they control access to this is through economic cost. This is their way of balancing the readiness of the player to handle the content. It means that they've had to build up some items and some character power before they're even going to be able to afford to access the content. We got some more pseudo confirmation of Delve being in the game, but Jonathan was very clear to point out that the extra content, the League content that they'll be porting over from PoE 1 will likely come later in the beta, and that all hands are on deck currently getting the campaign and the core endgame ready.
Delve has obviously been a feature for a very long time, so
but people will want to see that stuff, and so we want to make sure that we're doing it, and it isn't really that hard for us to bring things like that back.
Preach asked Jonathan about how the team is currently split across the two games, and Jonathan said that whilst some people are working on one or the other, there really isn't a hard split within the studio, and that everyone is contributing and sharing ideas between both titles. Preach then asked a really good question, and I want to give kudos to Preach because he was a fantastic interviewer throughout this entire conversation. But he asked the question, how will the team know what is worth backporting, and is it proving to be a bit of a challenge? Jonathan replied very positively, saying that it seems like there will be quite a lot of things that come from PoE 2 over to PoE 1, especially if they are unanimously and sort of universally accepted as better. The biggest example of this and the most poignant example of this is how instant trading is going to work in PoE 2.
We've talked previously about how we're planning on changing the way trade works in PoE 2. If that actually is seen as strictly better in PoE 2, then we'd have to start talking about, how can this stuff happen in PoE 1 as well.
Talking about content, Preach asked Jonathan one of the things that he was most proud of within PoE 2.
The thing that I'm the most proud of is boss design stuff. I just think that our bosses are really, really excellent. Like Mark is so good at doing that stuff. I think people are just going to have a blast fighting those bosses. Like they're so cool.
All right, now we're going to move over to some of the quality of life information that came out of the interview. One of the interesting tidbits to come out of this was Jonathan saying that now, when you're poisoned, your health orb will turn green. He said it just makes it a ton easier to see what is currently going on with your character. And it made me instantly think, well, what other effects are they going to be adding different visual elements to? We could think about bleed and that maybe the edge of your screen glows red, or something like blind where the corners of the screen come in a little bit and everything gets a little bit darker. These kind of visual cues can be incredibly helpful, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the new player experience later on. Carrying on with this theme, Preach asked the all-important question on everyone's mind about death recap. We've all experienced it in Last Epoch, and it's proved to be quite helpful for a lot of people. Jonathan said very positively that it is on his radar and that he is considering it. It's just that it's probably at the end of a line of other things that take priority right now.
I do think that that a death log can be a thing that we'll do, and I do feel like eventually we probably will do it.
Preach asked another question that is currently quite controversial in the ARPG space, which is about campaign skipping. Now, I'm not going to do Jonathan's answer justice, so here it is.
Never say never, right? But at the same time, it will probably be a pretty cold day in hell.
No, that's not fair. There's more to it than that.
The very fact that it keeps on coming up means that it will just keep on getting discussed. And look, there may come a time when I understand like a way that I can become satisfied with to still achieve all of the goals that we have here. But it's certainly not just going to be, oh, you just skip straight to endgame once you've done it once. Like, that is certainly, that will never happen.
He did make the point that second characters in a league in PoE 2 will much likely have a easier time. That is because of the way that gold scales later on in the game, but also that you're going to have a massive stash of uncut gems potentially. So you're going to have access to any skill you want very early on in the game, as well as twink gear and leveling uniques as we are accustomed to. Okay, so bringing us onto a pretty hefty chunk of the interview, and that was the new player experience. With Preach having only fairly recently got his chops in PoE, and his audience largely being outside of the PoE player base, this was an interesting one. At the end of the day, we all want PoE 2 to be as huge as possible, and in order for that to happen, as many players have got to get over that initial speed bump of what the hell is going on with this game, can I pick it up, can I get into it, and then become unhinged like the rest of us and have 5,000 plus hours. In testing what these speed bumps actually are, Jonathan found quite surprising. So to start, they've been doing quite a lot of testing of ARPG players who aren't PoE players, and Preach, being one of those people, did share that he found it quite daunting when he first started. Jonathan had an interesting response here, and he said that they have been talking about this, and that what they think partly is happening is that because PoE 1 is so old and there's so many veteran players in the game, that new players coming into it have this sense or feeling that they're so far behind that to get to where these veteran players are, which is where they want to be to feel maybe competitive or feel like they're playing the game properly, would be such a mountain to climb. Whereas in PoE 2, with the launch of the game, everyone will be in the same boat. And because the systems will be different and there'll be lots of new things, that a lot of new players won't get that sense of overwhelming complexity. Essentially saying that maybe it's not the depth of content in the game or the breadth of content, but just that the game's been around so long that the player base who have solved the game kind of intimidate the players that are new to it. Another funny thing that they've realised from their testing so far is that they are pretty bad at skill descriptions. Jonathan said that they could do better in this regard and probably make them a bit clearer and more elegant. Going into the testing, Jonathan scaled up the difficulty of the game to essentially make it where he thought it was difficult himself, and had a big fear that they were going to give this to new players and difficulty was just going to crush them and they were going to be turned off by that. He surprisingly actually found that difficulty didn't seem to be the big issue, and that accessibility doesn't necessarily relate to easy, that those things aren't necessarily correlated. In a very wholesome moment, Jonathan talked about testing the game with his wife and was sitting back and was shocked to see how good she was at dodge rolling the mechanics, but then certain things like not being able to read how much life was in her health bar and running around for like 30 seconds on 5% life whilst having full flasks. They then picked up on the visual feedback importance and things like poison making your health bar go green thread.
Having it so that when you get shocked, that is more obvious. Having it so that when you're bleeding, that is more obvious. Like, these kinds of things like can immediately improve. Like, just making the clarity in the moment better. Like, you add the little subtle like breathing of the character. You add like a little heartbeat that comes in as you get really low. You add the like slight like amount of like redness from the sides of the screen. Like you do like a bunch of little changes, and then when you get to the end of that, and players may not even notice that anything changed, but yet suddenly they're using flasks when they weren't before.
Jonathan asked Preach a question, as he likes to do in these interviews, and asked him, how much do you think you should die as a player? Preach said, ideally, I don't think you should, and Jonathan had a pretty strong response, which was, well, actually, I think if you let players die early on, then they understand that this is a game that they will die in, referring to Souls-like games. This did make me think that I suppose by allowing players to die and setting that expectation, you create a much higher ceiling of like the sense of achievement when you do get through a boss and you understand the mechanics and skill is driving that. Alright, so talking about skill and skills, they did touch on this quite a lot. First, Jonathan made a pretty bold statement about the evolving nature of combat in PoE 2 and how that with every iteration of the game, every system they add, it's getting more robust, more interesting and kind of surprising them.
There's been a lot of changes just a basic game feel even since the last time we showed anything. When we showed the Mercenary, we showed off like WASD and move while shooting and stuff like that. And effectively, like, more things have happened since then based on the capabilities that we have, now with doing that stuff and even going further. Like we're just kind of doing a lot more of that sort of stuff.
One of the things they were surprised about was the success of WASD.
It actually is almost the case universally in the office now that almost everyone here is using WASD exclusively.
A nice bonus, he said, is that the improvements to WASD are actually transferring really nicely over to point and click, and that it turns out to be a win-win for everyone. Preach asked about combat speed in PoE 2 and the slower feel of it that we've seen, and Jonathan pretty blankly said that the slower feeling of combat and the slower pace, it turns out to be a result of combat just being better. They then talked about one-handed and two-handed weapons, and that the reason that the warrior in the ExileCon 2023 demo was so slow was because it had the slowest possible combination of things. It was a warrior that wasn't stacking attack speed, they had a two-handed maul, and were using skills that were specifically slower and charged up. He mentioned that even more stun changes have been made in the game, further from what we'd seen in the ExileCon 2023 demos. They felt that the Huntress and the Monk had a pretty good pace to them as a class, and that they are using those as guides for the other classes in terms of getting that same feeling of fluidity. Preach then asked about respecking, and gold respec is still in the game, and Jonathan felt that there are a ton of other improvements that are making respecking feel better. The uncut gem system means that you can save up gems and you can get exactly what skill you want when you do want to change. Plus an important note that skill now in PoE 2 can kind of make up a little bit for the lack of items when you do switch over. This gets onto a broader and crucial point about player skill in PoE 2. In my recent video essay on the Butcher, I showed this graph, trying to illustrate what's pretty difficult to explain in words. Basically, PoE 2 allows for a much higher skill bar and mechanical skill from the player through combos and dodging that can allow a player, if they are slightly undergeared or they drop a gear piece because they want to change over and do something different, the opportunity to really focus in, learn a specific fight or learn a combo mechanic and make up for that item weakness temporarily. Alright, now onto the miscellaneous questions that didn't quite fit in anywhere else. Preach asked about console updates, and he said that, he loves couch co-op, he would love to see this in PoE 2. Jonathan once again iterated that they are not ready to talk about consoles, confirmed that he definitely wants this to happen, and that they do have members of the team now that are dedicated to the console side of the game. Next up, they talked about big story changes potentially coming even at this stage in development. So I'm going to play the clip.
I have in my mind that we might need to go and change significantly the way conversations even are. Mm-hmm. And we certainly haven't done that yet. And we're getting, very close to beta.
Even though they have recorded thousands of lines of dialogue, they might actually have to change up how this works slightly, because it's so difficult in ARPG games to get the balance between, okay, you're driving the player forward all the time and the player's always wanting to go faster, do the next thing, and how do you get them to stop and talk to someone? And as he said, when I was a child, I asked my mother about... are you ever going to really take your time to stop? And it's a massive problem that goes across the ARPG space, I think, where you don't obviously stop for dialogue and then you don't really know what's happening in the story. Now, we've seen that they've sort of tried to do something with teleporting in NPCs, like we saw with Alva in the Act 3 demo, and that gave me a lot of hope that they'd had some new innovative sort of solutions for this. But from what Jonathan's saying, he's still quite concerned about it and is seriously considering changing up the entire way it works. I would love to know your guys' thoughts on this. Do you have any examples that immediately come to mind where an ARPG or a game like it has just nailed the way that it's kind of woven the story? And now Jonathan did say that obviously they are looking at how they can do this thematically, and that our characters have some more voice lines, and that the plot in sort of exposition is done a bit more fluidly and a bit more upfront. I'd really love to hear your guys' thoughts on what creative solutions have you seen or have you just got that come to mind for how to solve this. Alright, so this was just a nice heartwarming moment that I wanted to put in here, which was Preach asking Jonathan how he felt about the game.
From my perspective, PoE 2 is the game I always wanted PoE 1 to be. and it was only limitations that led us not to be able to do that.
Alright mate, we are on the precipice of some incredible news and updates for PoE 2. You can see it in Jonathan's tone and his voice that he is so excited about the game and getting the game out there. There were no huge surprises or big info drops in this interview, and I think that bodes well in a couple of very important ways. The first is that we still know there are tons of features that we just don't know anything about in the game. Things like how mapping works, how crafting has changed, and how ascendancies work and how you get them. The list goes on, and there's so much they still have to share with us. I feel that up until this point, most of these interviews and the interview questions have been around addressing concerns of the player base. Now it feels like there is an open road ahead of us, and they're not going to be talking about the things that they're fixing, but the things that they're innovating on, the things that they're adding and bringing to the game. New things that we might not expect and that might shock us. To the second point, I feel like this interview showed the amount of confidence that Jonathan and the team behind him are building. Not only does he feel more confident speaking about the game, but you can tell how proud he is. Talking about the boss design, the combat, the user experience, and all the testing they've been doing. This air of confidence has got me more and more hyped to see all the stuff that they've been cooking up and the stuff that we're going to see on the 21st of March with the first ever GGG live show, and all the content that we're going to see from the Creators Weekend over in LA from Talkative Try, Ziz, Mathel, Preach himself, and many others. What a time to be a PoE player, with another league just around the corner to keep us busy whilst the hype train keeps rolling in. Friends, Exiles, all aboard. I will see you in the next one. Ta-da.